Welcome to Stirring the Cauldron. Now, here's your host, Marla Brooks.
Hey, Merry Meet everybody, and welcome to Stirring the Cauldron here on ParaX Radio. We're going to have a terrific show tonight with my guest, author and shadow chaser, Philip Spencer. Philip is an investigative reporter in the world of investigative researcher in the world of strange animals and paranormal activity. He's the author of The Wild Man of Kentucky, The Mystery of Panther Rock, which can be found in book and DVD format. And he's worked with the TV show Monster Quest on the History Channel and done about a bazillion other things. He's also a 30-year investigator and has amassed a huge number of case files in his research of strange events that have occurred around the world. Bigfoot, however, is one of his preferred areas of research. And when Philip was last on my show a while back, we talked about his book, The Wild Man of Kentucky, and one of the most active paranormal places in the nation, the Fraser Land. He's currently working on a new project which will be different than anything done before in the Sasquatch research field, and there's a major announcement about that coming soon. But tonight, because it's the Halloween season, we're going to be telling some ghost stories with Philip, because wearing the investigator hat, he's got some really good ones. So please join me in welcoming Philip Spencer. Hey, Philip, welcome back for a little more Cauldron Stirring.
Hello, Marla. Thank you so much for having me. I really look forward to the show tonight.
Oh, well, before we get into the ghost stories, I'd kind of like to set the tone with one of the eeriest sounds that I've ever heard, and that is the Fraser howl. So before we let everyone hear it, could you please kind of set it up for us for those who don't know what that's all about?
Sure, be glad to. In my investigation of the Fraser Land, the individual known as the ex-farmer had so much very strange, just very unusual activity that I left a small handheld digital recorder with an external omnidirectional mic, and I told him, I said, keep this close to you. If you hear something, just hit that button, point that microphone, and record it. And late one night, as he was standing on the porch of his cabin with his dogs in the yard, this strange, unusual howl began. Luckily, he had the sense about him to grab that recorder and record this sound. I've had this sound analyzed, listened to by some very knowledgeable people in the world of acoustic analysis. No one is truly sure what could possibly have made this, but as everyone listens to this, take notice of something. Listen to the dogs and listen to how they do almost nothing.
It's really a fascinating, creepy sound, and in fact, Reverend Tim heard it this afternoon when I told him to upload it. And Tim, what was your comment? Come on in.
Well, I got to tell you, I've spent a lot of time out in the woods. I do a lot of primitive work where we go out and live off the land, basically. We take a weapon and we take a knife, and we pretty much harvest our own food while we're out there for anywhere between
right.
a weekend to a whole week. And to be totally honest with you, I would. Well, I don't. This is a family show, so I'm going to say I won't tell you exactly the way I said it, but I will admit that I would poop my pants if I heard that. I've heard a lot of howling in the woods. I've heard the coyotes. I've heard wolves. I've never heard nothing of that tone. I mean, it was like, wow. And what I was impressed by is when I heard the recording, you're right, listen to the dogs. You would think that they'd be going crazy.
Well, really, the dogs are so important. I've been around those dogs. When we were in there filming the movie, and one of those dogs had to actually be put up because it was so aggressive. And these are old, rough, tough farm dogs.
Right.
And when you come onto that land, well, you're in their house.
Exactly.
That's their house. And nothing comes around there. The ex-farmer told me after this, he said, Philip, I have never, ever seen those dogs act like that. He said they acted like they were confused. Their heads were tilting and their ears were perking, and they didn't know what to do, and they never made a move.
That to me is amazing, because anybody that has any kind of encounter with farm dogs,
right?
They're territorial. They revert right back to almost wolf-like
very
instincts.
Much so.
Right. I mean, we're talking about a pack mentality here. And when one starts, I mean, they'll circle you, they'll bark, they'll growl, I mean, they'll nip at you.
Exactly what these dogs did when we were there, and I had been around. The video, the filming crew and so forth had not. But even with that, they did exactly what you're saying, and it didn't surprise me. That's what farm dogs like this do. And that's okay. They do it for a purpose.
Right.
But whatever this was, I have no idea what did this. But also everybody should remember, whatever was doing this was 350 yards away. It was over a hill. It was down in a creek bed in a really, really thickly overgrown area. I've been down in there, and I cleaned it up and I increased the volume some on this. But other than that, it hadn't been touched. I have the original WAV file of it.
It's incredible because, once again, being out in the woods and hearing all this stuff, I mean, and, you get used to it. You get used to your environment. So, I mean, when you're out there, you're hearing howls and stuff. I mean, we literally had a bear walk 20 yards from us, grunting and everything. Nobody ever woke up. I mean, you hear banging and stuff. You get used to the environment. I've never heard anything like that in my life. Never. And that's...
I've always said this, Tim. I've always said this. I'm the same as you. I spent a lot of my life out in the hollers and valleys and hills and all those areas of central Kentucky around Anderson County. And I can't even imagine what I would have felt like if whatever this was cut loose about 20 yards away from me.
Well, I know what I would feel like, and that would include changing my underwear. Hey, I'm gonna play this twice, so let's listen to the Fraser howl, guys. Here we go. Now, what I'm impressed by is the fact that you can actually hear the dogs barking, and you can tell it's not... Once again, I mean, I've heard coyotes and I've heard wolves. That does not have the same sound as a wolf.
No, that's a totally different... Coyotes, wolves, everything that I heard myself, others outdoorsmen that I've talked to, those two animals were eliminated early on. We've discussed other types of dogs. That doesn't seem to fit. One of the acoustic analysis places, their answer was, well, it has to be a dog. And the reason they said that was because they didn't have a clue what it could be. Exactly.
When you don't have a clue, you just go to the most common denominator.
That's right.
Well, let me play this again for our listening audience, and I'm going to turn it back over to Miss Marla.
Okay.
All right.
Wow. It really is creepy. I mean, that's all I can say. And it's one of those things that you don't want to hear around a campfire.
Right.
But,
yeah.
I mean, you've listened to it 1,000 times and whatever. What do you have any impression about what you think that might have been?
No.
Okay.
I wish I did. And believe me, I've talked about this with very knowledgeable people. We've bounced the idea back and forth about a hoax, about somebody somehow figuring out some way to do this. There's some technical aspects about it that make me very inclined not to believe that. The dogs are a bit key in it. I can say this. Whatever did this is an animal. I believe it's big because this was 350 yards away, down behind the hill. Mm-hmm. And this recorder was pointed in that direction. It wasn't a very, really high-tech piece of equipment, but it did the job well. I don't know what this was, and we may never know, but I do know this. This area, the Fraser land, and the surrounding areas in Anderson County, they have a long history of some very, very strange and actually frightening events and stories, Marla, that go way back in history.
I know. I mean, it's a fascinating area, and it's not. And we'll get in the ghost stories, but this is good for now. I mean, I love talking about this. It's just like so unlikely. If somebody said that there's a place called the Fraserland, somewhere in Kentucky, a lot of people just kind of scratch their heads,
right.
and not what's so different about that. But I mean, yeah, I heard that little giggle from you. It is different.
Very much so. The Fraserland is not even known to people who live there. It's in a rather unknown, obscure reference to the land. The story that was told to me was, it is said that an elderly woman, a very elderly woman, was talking to a man one day about this place. And she took her hand and she moved it across like the horizon. And she said, as far as you can see, this used to be the Fraserland. And one night they were here, one day they were here, and the next day they were gone. And the story is that the Frasers had 6,000 acres under a land grant. And sure enough, one day they were there, and the next day they were gone. To my knowledge, no one knows what happened. I mean, it could have been something as simple as just hard times and couldn't make it. But I will tell you this. My speculation on that is they might have just found out they were someplace they didn't want to be.
I mean, from what I recall in reading your book, stepping foot, like 2 feet away, it's one thing. When you step into it proper, there's a whole different air about it, a whole different feeling, and it's not particularly comfortable.
That's true. I'll tell you this, Marla, there's a lot that I wasn't even able to talk about in the book. There is so much more I know about this. But I also want to say this. The people in this area, I lived in Anderson County in Lawrenceburg for over 40 years. And it's just like the most wonderful little town, and the people are just amazing. It really is. It's beautiful beyond description, but the people, more or less, it's like they'll help their neighbors any way they can, but they're still rather private people and keep to themselves. Just good people. But many of them, they have no idea about this history and these stories. I spoke to one man that lived 1,500 yards from Panther Rock, the cave, and had so for 30 years and didn't even know it was there. I think that says a little bit about how things can be right in your backyard that are almost mind-boggling as far as the stories connected with them, and you never even know it was there.
How did you find out about it?
I lived there for 40-some-odd years, and I'd heard stories about it since I was a kid, and I cannot even begin to tell you the hours, days, weeks, months, years that I spent back in that area. I came, hiked, explored endlessly. That was where you could find me. I loved it. It was just a magnificent, rough area. Not that really far from the main town. Lawrenceburg is the city there. But it was just a place where my friends and I all went. we felt very comfortable there, even though there was so many things that happened. Like I had seen I saw these blue lights shoot up from the cave one night while we were camping about 3 o'clock in the morning. Never seen anything like it. Beyond explanation. Cannot to this day even begin to tell you what those lights were. It was just unbelievable to see it. Where did these lights come from? There's no place that it could have come from. This cave runs to a woods that you couldn't cut your way through. It's so thick down in there. No place for anybody to go. This magnificent bluish-white beam shooting up from the cave 150 feet below you up into the sky at 3 o'clock in the morning without a sound. And the lights, stories of the lights, and then in the book, as you know, there were very frightening attacks. Dogs viciously mauled by some kind of animal. A cow with an eye torn out and its ears ripped off to the bone and massive claw marks in its back. We found, the ex-farmer found a track approximately 20 inches long. When he drew it out, it looked just like what you would consider an extremely large Sasquatch track. I mean, I could just go on and on. But one thing I will bring up, all the people that hunt this property area back in there, I talked to several of them. And unbeknownst to any of them, one did not know I was talking to the other. I keep those things kind of separated. They all told me the same thing. They said there's something back in there. There is something that moves through those trees. They said you can almost hear it. You can feel it as it cuts through the trees and goes from one place to another. They said it's like some kind of wind. Something is back there that is not normal, is what they would all say.
And not maybe living in the sense that we know what life is?
Very much so. I absolutely agree with that. I think I mentioned before when I was with you on the show, I'm very much a proponent of multiple dimensions. I'm very much a proponent of that. And just for the sake of thinking about it, not saying that it's factual, not even to the point of a theory, maybe not even a hypothesis. Perhaps there's a portal. That would explain a lot. I try not to use that as an easy way out to try to explain a lot of things. I don't want to do that. But this, for the sake of saying and discussion, that would certainly explain a lot of these bizarre, strange happenings. Some kind of portal connected with this cave. Could it be possible? I saw the blue light myself. I saw the shadow creature myself. Those were my two main things in this area. And then I started investigating, the Fraser mud track, this huge predator track that was found. That's what was the catalyst for this story. Too much going on in one area. Just absolutely too many things happening. You find interesting stories here and there. But when you get one area, Marla, that has all this going on, I mean, what in the world has happened? Now, yes, it's over a long time span, but it's still within the Fraser Lane.
I just got a very interesting question from Speed Racer in the chat room, I think in regards to the howl. And he wonders, how do you think this animal would respond to a sensitive and psychic type person?
I'm not sure how someone would answer that question, as what would you have to go on to base that assumption on? Do you follow me? I mean, I can't even have a personal opinion on that because I have no idea what that was. I don't know if whatever this was would somehow intuitively connect with someone, or I don't know if it would eat them. Honestly, I don't know.
Yeah, well, he just followed up and wondered if it was possible to communicate with these creatures telepathically. Again, that's an unknown, not knowing what it may be.
I don't know how. Once again, I can't answer that. If I had an example, if I had a known instance, and there are reports here and there of people claiming to intuitively and psychically communicate with creatures and animals. I'm not one to disbelieve. I'm very open-minded, and I listen to everything. But when we're talking specifically about this creature, I don't know, because I don't know what this creature is.
Well, and the other thing is, yeah, we don't know that it is an animal.
Right.
You know,
I don't know. I mean, there's an assumption. There is a natural, I think, assumption among us that our mindsets tend to lead us to that thought, that this is an animal. But on the other hand, believe me, I've seen things in this area that were not related to any biological life form that I know of. I can assure you of that. And others have told me the same thing. So once again, we don't know what we're dealing with. When we hear a sound like that, and we pick it up on an apparatus, a mechanical apparatus, even digitalized, we assume that it's a biological entity like us making a sound that we're hearing. But on the other hand, we don't know that. We really don't know that.
That's what makes it so interesting. I wonder, when you played back the sound of the digital, did anyone have the least bit of an idea to go after where that sound came from?
Oh, we had been there. Oh,
yeah, but I mean, right after you heard it? Yeah.
No, he went back in the house and locked the door. That's exactly what happened. He went back in the house, and the reason he did that was because of the way the dogs acted. That's why he went back in. He was not, this was maybe 12 at night, somewhere in that area when this happened.
Yeah.
And with all the bizarre, strange things that were occurring on this family's property, he was not going to go looking. You know, I have to admit, I would have been tempted to go right to it. But I understand. When he called me and told me what was going on, he was, needless to say, he's an outdoor guy, pretty fearless guy. He was pretty shook up.
Yeah, well, I would have been too. It's scary. We are going to take a quick break, Phil, and when we come back, somebody in the chat room said this is kind of a very spooky show when we need to serve popcorn. So this is good for a good late night scare. I'm here with Philip Spencer, the Wild Man of Kentucky, not to be confused with our own Wild Man of Kentucky, Para X Dave. We got a lot of wild men in Kentucky, I guess. You know, as I mentioned earlier, I think most people know you because of your books on Bigfoot and Fraserland and this and that. And not so much about the paranormal investigator side of you, and that's where some of these ghost stories you're going to share with us come from. So before we hunker down and get ready for some great stories, tell us how you got into the field of paranormal investigating to begin with, and then where did Bigfoot come in?
Well, it just seemed almost a natural progression, actually, Marla. The area where I grew up was full of folklore and tall tales. So many strange and unusual things happening. I don't really have an explanation as to why these areas were so conducive to that. Like I told you about Anderson County and Lawrenceburg, just one of the most beautiful places in the world, with the best people you could ever find. But there's just a lot of paranormal activity. The catalyst for my interest in Bigfoot started when I lived in the small town of Alton, which is a very rural little town. And one day when I was 9 or so years old, I was walking back through the fields, and in the middle of a large field, I found this huge track. It was a single track. It was a right foot, but it only had 3 toes. This totally just mystified me. I never forgot it. It was many years later when I found out that Stan Gordon had a picture on his website up in Pennsylvania of a single 3-toed track that had been associated with a Bigfoot sighting. Out in Arkansas, Smokey Crabtree, who I'd spoken with on the phone, he had some reports of the same thing. Personally, I didn't really associate what I saw with Bigfoot. I've never been able to associate it with anything because it was in the middle of an enormous field, and there was one track, but it was absolutely 100% a track. But that was probably my catalyst into the world of Bigfoot. Plus, I had my own sighting in 1970 in the area of Glennsboro, Kentucky. The ghost, the apparitions, I was also fascinated by that. And I spent a great deal of my time. If I heard a story anywhere, I went to check it out. And it did not take me long to learn that, yes, there are many folk tales and folklore and many embellished stories passed around the campfires. But I also found out that this stuff is absolutely real. And I found out in a big way.
All right, tell us a ghost story.
I think I'll stick within the Fraser land. I was going to drift out of Anderson County into another story that would take a little bit too long, but let me tell you about something that happened.
Okay.
I worked at a rock quarry. This was down on the Kentucky River. It was actually within the Fraser land. And this is a large quarry with huge underground limestone caverns that you could drive tractor and trailer trucks through. Over on the left, if you were looking west, out over this quarry from the office, was a valley, a river valley, a creek valley that ran back up through the hills called Six Creeks. Well, I was the night security guard there. That was my job. I was there from about 5 or 6 in the afternoon to 6 o'clock in the morning by myself at night. And I'll try to give this description. The office that I would go into had large glass windows, so I could see out over this large quarry, rock quarry. And every afternoon when I got there, I would go into the quarry, to the office, usually get me something to drink, maybe sit down a few minutes before it was 6 o'clock, and I had to go out and check the property and drive down into the big caverns and make sure nobody had wandered in there and got lost and all that. And it was a November day. It was about maybe 6, close to 6. And I parked my truck out by the office, and I went into the office, and I went over to the refrigerator, and I got me a drink. And I walked over. I did this every day, creature of habit, I guess. And I would stand there, and I would get my water or whatever it was I was drinking. I would open it, stand there and drink it, and just look out those windows. It was a gorgeous view with a huge bridge called the Tyrone Bridge and the Wild Turkey Distillery up on the cliffs above it and so forth. And so I turned my drink up approximately 75 yards up this road that ran up the hillside. There was an entrance to an old rock road that ran back through 6 creeks. You crossed 6 creeks on this old rock road to get to the end of the property back in there. A long drive and a rough drive. Well, I turned my drink up. The fog was laying close to the top of the cliffs. It was drizzling, and I turned my drink up, and as I did, I saw something come out of that rock road and just stop in the middle of the asphalt road and then go back in. Now, when I first saw this, my mind just could not register what had happened. I mean, I knew what I saw, but I was still going, wait a minute. I didn't just see that. So there I stood with my drink still up, actually, looking up that area. And all of a sudden, she came out again and floated directly out in the middle of that road. Paused a minute and floated back into that old rock road. I jumped out. I went out the door, jumped in my truck, drove straight to that rock road and pulled in. I got out. I looked for tracks. I went up on the hill the best I could. It's dank. I looked over the 100-foot drop-off. I drove back into the creeks. I looked everywhere for this woman. I drove back and just sat. You know, I knew that that I wasn't going to find anything. But I'll tell you what I saw now. I saw a woman float out into the middle of that road. And she had on a green sweater with long gray hair that came down to her waist on the back. She had no legs, and she never turned. She was facing up that hill. The first time, it shook me so much that I wasn't sure if I had seen it or not. The second time, I knew exactly what I was looking at. So, as you can imagine, I was just, wow. 2 days later, my friend worked up the hill at the Wild Turkey Distillery as a guard. He had been on vacation. He came down to see me. I couldn't wait to tell him what I had seen. So he came down at night. He sat beside me in his truck. We were talking. I said, I got something to tell you. He said, well, I've got something to tell you, too. So I told him what I had seen, and he just sat there and looked at me. And he said, I want you to swear to me that you're not messing with me. I said, what do you mean? He said, let me tell you what I have to tell you. He said, I stopped up at the distillery, and one of the mechanics just told me this, that him and his son were back on the railroad tracks, which run between the rock quarry and the distillery up on the cliff. He said they were back there late in the evening working on an old tractor. And he said his son said, Daddy, Daddy, he was a little boy. He said, Daddy, Daddy, who is that woman? And this man turned and looked, and there was a woman fading into the darkness. It was almost dark, and she had on a green sweater and long gray hair. And no legs. And we both just sat there and looked at each other. But that's not the end of the story. As I sat there a little bit later that night, something dawned on me. At least 15 years before that, maybe 10, I'd been all the way back in those creeks with a girl. And she was sunbathing, and I was just leaning against my truck, and I looked down the field, maybe a 50-yard field. And I saw somebody lean out from behind a tree and lean back. And I got up and turned, and I looked. And the girl said, what are you looking at? And I said, I just saw a woman with long gray hair peep out behind that tree. And she said, what are you talking about? We jumped in the truck and drove down there. There was nothing. So a few days later, I went down to this little town called Tyrone, little river town right down below the quarry. And I talked to an old feller that lived down there for many years and knew everything. And we sat down on the porch in some old chairs, and I told him what I saw. And he went, so you seen her too, huh, boy? I said, what do you mean? He said, I've seen that woman twice in my life. And they found her back up in them creeks years ago. He said they found her back up there, and whatever got her, it wasn't human. Yeah.
All right, I've got goosebumps now, and I'm sitting in the dark. That'll teach me not to turn on the lights. I mean,
yeah, that was just...
Well, yeah. I mean, that had to be, when it's verified by other people with history.
Right. Well, I left out a little piece of what he said.
Okay.
He said, she's what does that screaming back up in there. Mm. And I just sat there. I didn't say anything. I just listened to him. Mm-hmm. And I kept that in mind, Marla. And real quickly, about 2 months later, I was sitting in the quarry, about 3 o'clock in the morning. I had my dog in my truck with me, windows down, facing to the west, and all at once, back up in those creeks, there was a scream, like, you think the Fraser howl is creepy? Mm. It's nothing compared to this. Mm. My dog shot straight up in the seat, slammed his head into the top of my truck. I grabbed a gun and backed away from my window and threw it out the window. There was no doubt in my mind I was dead, even though this unbelievable howling, moaning, screaming was coming from that valley. And it stopped. My dog was just trembling. It was a big dog, too, and leaning on me. And there we sat, just like that. And all of a sudden, it did it again. But this time, it was further away. It was moving back through the creeks. And it stopped. And so there we sat. My dog trembling, just kind of growling. I was holding a pistol out the window. For what reason, I don't know. And then this happened. At the top of this hill and down the road a little bit was the local animal shelter. And as I said, just down the road, across a little bridge, was the town of Tyrone. All at once, at the same time, every dog started moaning and howling. I can't even describe this to you or the people listening. It is beyond explanation. I've heard a single dog do this howl, and I've always called it a death howl. That's what I referred to it as. Mm-hmm. But this was all of them at the same time. Uh-huh. And just like they started, they stopped.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. Welcome to the Fraser land.
Well, I'm watching the chat room, and I've had about 3 or 4 people beg for another story. And we can go over a little bit. There's nobody following my show.
Okay.
So if you wouldn't mind sticking around a little bit longer, they would just love to hear another one.
Well, how much longer? I've got one, but it's not a short story, but it's the story of all stories.
Well, let's do it. We've got the time. We've got the time.
Okay, well, here we go. This is the story of all of my escapades into the paranormal.
Now, wait a minute. Do I need to turn on a light now?
You need to turn out the lights and just sit very quietly. And remember this, you only see a ghost from the corner of your eye.
Okay.
Okay, let me tell this story.
Okay.
One night, many, many years ago, myself and several others were hanging out at a little restaurant called the Fairgrounds Drive-In in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky. Mm-hmm. This was the local hangout in this little town. This is where everybody went. Well, there was a group of guys standing over on one side of it talking. I knew several of them. I walked over there. Turns out that 3 of these individuals were from Fayette County, over around the Lexington, Kentucky area, and they were telling a story. Mm-hmm. And they were talking about this house, and they were just so excited. And they said there's a trail of blood that leads up to it, and when you get up to it, it'll be the most terrifying thing you've ever seen, and you can't even, nobody can even go in it, on and on and on. Well, that was just everything I could ever dream of. When I heard about something like this, point me to it. So I just talked to them. I got the location, told them I'd probably check that out. Well, there was 2 guys that I knew with me. And I turned around, walked off, and called them over with me. And I said, I'm going there now. And they said, are you serious? I said, I'm very serious. I said, I'm going right now. I said, do you want to go with me? And they said, sure. And off we went. Now, it did take us a while to find this place. And I'd heard stories. I've chased down stories like this so many times, and it turned out to be nothing. Lights, moss glowing, you name it. So we got there, pulled over, and I am condensing this, but it'll still be awesome. And so they had said there's a trail of blood that leads back to the house, and it starts on the fence at the gate. So we got out, and I had a little flashlight that I had taped so it wouldn't be too bright. And I started looking up and down this fence, and I found it. Now, I'm going to say this. Whatever this was, I've never, from the time I saw it to this moment, I am not going to say that this is blood. I have no idea what it was, but trust me on this. It looked exactly like coagulated blood. So it went over the fence, and I could see it going down this old rock lane. So over the fence we went. I said, let's just follow it. So here we go. It's a full moon night. We're walking back through these big fields, following this old rock road. And I thought, well, I'm going to assume that this trail of whatever this is going to lead me to the scariest house to ever exist, according to these guys. So we're walking back, and we cross a little creek with a little stone bridge, and up ahead on the left, I noticed these big trees. And you could even, from where I was, I could see there was a circular aspect to them. And I could also see that the rock road veered off and went up through an arch. And I told these guys, I said, what? I said, hey, there we go. And sure enough, that red trail, now it wasn't solid, it was intermittent. It went straight up under that arch. So we walked up under that arch. And Marla, let me tell you, when we cleared the trees and walked into this huge circle, there sat this house. It was like everything a horror movie producer ever dreamed of. Over to the right in the yard was a tree with 4 graves. The story was this was an aunt and uncle that had been murdered by their nephew and niece, and that was their graves. This house, I want everybody to just picture this in your mind. You were looking at an old square brick house. It had a single front porch. There were 4 big windows symmetrically placed on the square of the front. The upper 2 windows were completely broken out. On top of this house were 2 round steeples that went up to points on these big caps. Now stop and think about what I just described to you. If you think about it, it's a face. The front door is the mouth. The 2 broken out windows are the eyes. And then up on top are these big steeples that go up to points. And we just stood there. And those guys, said, what are we going to do? And I said, we're going in. That's what we came here for. So we went up to the porch. The trail went up the steps. It went up to the door. And so, there was this moment when I had to reach and get that doorknob. And you always think, when you open this door, everything bad in existence is going to grab you and take you in this house.
Yes.
But I grabbed it and I pushed it, and we just stood there. And we started shining our little light in and looking. And so I slowly eased into the house. The trail, this was a hallway that went entrance hall, wide, and it went to the steps that went up. This is very important. Mm-hmm. Over to the left was a wide opening, and in there was a room. When I shined my light into that room, it was just the most bizarre thing you've ever seen. It was just like millions of reflections. I mean, we were just, whoa, you know. And so I eased over and looked. Well, that is where the spiral staircase went up into the steeple. And at one time, the inside of the staircase had been covered in glass, in mirrors. And they were all broken and scattered, and it was the light reflected. Okay. So we went back out, and we followed the red trail. It went up one flight to a platform, turned left, up another flight, and then up to the second floor. Then it went down a hallway. So we walked up, we followed it down the hall, it turned and went under a door. Now, this house was been abandoned. There was nothing in the rooms. Windows were out, you know, that kind of deal. Were we trespassing? 100%. But anyway, so we stood there at this door. Now, everybody check this out. There were these boards across the door frame. There was a door on this room. There were spider webs on these. Just like every haunted house you've ever seen in your life. And I told them, I said, look, I have got to look in this room. I've got to. And they were telling me I was absolutely insane. They were freaking out. And I said, just chill out. I got to look in this room. So I pulled these boards off to the point where they would fall down. I didn't pull them completely off. I just let them swing down, okay, and left the bottom. Okay. I reached and got that doorknob. And when I did, now this was in about July in Kentucky, when it is hot. I grabbed that doorknob, and it was just crazy cold. And yeah, I thought, what is going on here? So I turned the doorknob and I pushed it. Well, everybody's seen the movies, has heard the stories of how the room you enter is cold. You can even see your breath. Well, let me tell you, that's a fact.
Wow.
It was just, anyway. So I pushed the door and I looked in, and I looked around, and this room was furnished. It was a bedroom. There was blood splatter everywhere you could look. There was blood stains, unbelievable blood stains on the bed, on the floor. There were cobwebs. And all of a sudden, I heard two sets of feet rapidly leaving. And I turned and looked, and the guys had hit the road. They had seen all they wanted to see. So there I stood, you know, halfway in this room, looking at this scene. But, I mean, it's just, I mean, right now, I can see it. And I want to do this real quick. I want to jump to the next night. I left. I closed the door. I left. I walked all the way back out to the truck where the guys were sitting. Left. I went and got a couple of other guys that had been around me before when I'd done stuff like this. Went back the next night. Same process. I'm condensing this for you.
Okay.
Okay, we go to the door. We go up the steps, okay? And I start down that hallway. And as I start to approach that room, you know how when there's something going on and your mind is telling you, wait a minute, something's not right with this picture.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I felt.
Mm-hmm.
And as I got up to the door, I looked. Well, you know those boards that I told you I tore ends off so they would drop down?
Mm-hmm.
Well, they were right back, just exactly like they had been. The spider webs were there. I even ran my finger up one of them and knocked the dust off. And these were old nails. They were square top nails. They weren't like modern round nails.
Right.
And those guys said, hey, you said you did this. I said, man, I did do this. I did that. You can ask those other guys. And they said, well, what's going on? You know, blah, 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 blah.
Mm-hmm.
They booked. They turned, and they were gone. Once again, I'm standing at this door, and that's when it happened. They left. They ran. I'm standing. Now, this was still the moon. The old windows were out up on the second floor. And so I thought, well, what am I going to do? I'm not going to hang around here. This is a little bit too much. I turned, Marla, to go, and out of the wall of that bedroom came this black, dark, I don't even know how to describe this thing. It floated right out of that wall and was just there. And there I stood, and there it was. And all at once, it was just like it opened these eyes, and they were them just this deep red. And I just stood there. There wasn't really a lot I could have, I just stood there. And all of a sudden, it just sucked back into that room. And I thought, that I'm out of here. I am done with this place. I walked down the steps, out the door, and headed down to the arched entrance. I stopped and turned and looked back. And when I did, up in the top right steeple, I saw those two big red eyes. It's like it opened and closed. I left, did the same thing, back out to the truck, got in it, left. About several months later, that house burned to the ground, and nobody knows why.
Wow.
But I will tell you this. I'm absolutely, no question in my mind, that night in that house, that I was face to face with pure. That's exactly how I feel about it.
Yeah. And somebody in the chat room just said you walked down the steps rather than ran like hell.
Yeah, that's what I did. Walked out and left.
You're a very brave soul, you know that.
Yeah, I don't know, brave or foolish, one of the two.
Wow, that it's kind of like, what do you make of that? You know what you saw,
man,
and you kind of think you know what it was, but oh my God.
Well, I mean, that is a true story. That happened. I found very few people that even start to believe me about that. But that happened. I can't explain it other than to say, well, there you go. Welcome to paranormal, paranormal stuff. But that happened. That happened. I don't know about the story about the aunt and uncle and the killings by the nephew and so forth, but that tree was there with those 4 graves. You can bet on that. That house was there, and I've never seen a house. Like I say, it was like every horror movie producer could ever dream of. It looked like an evil face with those upstairs windows out and those big steeples. And this house, oh man, I've been places hunting ghosts and hunting down strange creatures and in caves and all this stuff. Never, ever, ever anything like this house. Never. Whatever that was. It almost looked oily. I don't even know how to describe it. But I was just standing there looking at this black form floating in the air, and all at once, when those eyes popped, boy, my heart went thump, 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 beat. I thought, this thing might just snatch my heart out of me, before I can do anything. But it just sucked back in that wall so quick. It was like what you see in the movies, It's what it was like, but it was happening right in front of me.
That is lovely, amazing. I mean, in a really good paranormal kind of way.
Yeah, that's I guess you would say, my big daddy story of all my adventures and that stuff. Yeah, I've got more and stuff, but that place, that place.
Oh. And it wasn't, and here's the sadness part of it, it wasn't as if you were going in there on a paranormal investigation and you had equipment and you had all this stuff with you.
Oh, no, I didn't. At that time, there wasn't any equipment. It was a matter, it was not exactly a situation where you could afford it was great to have the gas to get there in the old vehicle you were lucky to have running. It was kind of those days, but if I heard about them, I figured out a way to get there.
Somebody in the chat room just asked if this story took place in Anderson County, Kentucky.
No. It started there. That's where I heard the story, was at the Fairgrounds Drive-In at Anderson County late one night. This was in Fayette County.
Okay.
This is where the house was in Fayette County, Kentucky. Okay. The lady that floated out, Anderson County. The scream, Anderson County. Yes.
Well, I've got a whole new respect for Kentucky now. As far as all that really kind of neat stuff going on, although, I don't think I'd want to see anything black with red eyes. I think I would think that was anything but neat. But it's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. And
absolutely. It's just when things like this happen, it does things to you. Like when I saw Sasquatch walking through that river bottom near Glensboro, Kentucky, in Anderson County, my life changed forever. Forever. It embeds something in you. You just cannot stop wanting to know what's going on there. What is that? And then when you see things like this woman float out of that road, not once, but twice, or the scream, or then you see something, you find something like this house, how do you wrap your mind around that? There's not a lot of logical progression within common knowledge that would lead you to say this, blah, blah, blah. I mean, those things are not, a lot of people say, well, that's not supposed to happen. That can't be. Well, they can believe it or not. I don't care. It happened. Those are facts. But I will tell you, to this day, I have never, ever seen that color red. I don't know how to describe it. I don't. It just seems impossible to describe in those eyes.
Well, I really want to thank you for stopping by tonight. You made the chat room stop dead for a while, and yes, that's fun. And when they do, that means they're listening really hard, and that's a really good thing.
Well, I want to thank you, Marla. I really appreciate being here tonight. I love the show, love talking to you, and I want to thank everybody in the chat room and all the listeners. I truly appreciate all of them.
So until next time, everybody, blessed be and merry meet again. Good night.
This has been another edition of